Imagine an emperor, seated on his golden throne, commanding the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. And yet, despite all his power, he is about to learn a lesson that no senator, general, or tutor could ever teach him. The lesson comes from a man who lived in a barrel, shunned wealth, and scorned authority. This man was Diogenes of Sinope, the most infamous cynic of ancient Greece, and his encounter with Marcus Aurelius would leave a mark on the emperor's soul that no conquest could erase. It was the year 167 CE, a time when the Roman Empire stretched from the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt to the cold forests of Germania. Rome was a machine of power, discipline, and opulence, where emperors were worshipped as gods and wealth was measured in villas, jewels, and legions of soldiers. Among these rulers, Marcus Aurelius was different, revered not only for his military victories, but also for his devotion to Stoic philosophy, a school that preached reason, virtue, and the mastery of desires. Yet, even the Stoic emperor had blind spots, vulnerabilities that only someone like Diogenes could expose. You might be wondering, how could a man who lived centuries earlier, a notorious eccentric who begged for scraps and mocked kings, influence an emperor of Rome? The answer lies in a meeting shrouded in rumor, a fleeting moment in history, and a secret that almost no one would write down. According to whispers preserved by chroniclers like Diogenes Laertius, Marcus had long studied philosophy under the guidance of tutors and Stoic schools, seeking wisdom that would help him govern justly. Yet one lesson remained elusive: the raw, unfiltered truth about human desire, status, and happiness. Marcus, despite all his Stoic training, still wrestled with pride. He was burdened by the weight of expectation, by the constant scrutiny of the Senate, and by the haunting knowledge that Rome's stability rested on his decisions. Every triumph in the arena, every successful campaign along the Danube, offered only fleeting satisfaction. And that is precisely where Diogenes' lesson would strike, like a sudden wind cutting through the splendor of the palace. Picture it: Marcus walking through the bustling streets of Athens, or perhaps pondering the writings of earlier philosophers in the shadowed halls of the Palatine. He hears tales of an old man living in a tub, carrying nothing but a cloak and an unshakable disdain for material wealth. Some say Diogenes spat on those who boasted of riches. Others claim he mocked the scholars of his time for hiding behind language and reputation. Marcus, curious and restless, decides to see this man for himself. When he finally approaches, he finds Diogenes sunbathing in the marketplace, surrounded by nothing but a small lantern and an air of defiance. Observers would later recall the emperor's surprise, not at the man's poverty, but at his audacity. Here is a figure who treats kings and philosophers alike with the same irreverence, who laughs at the pomp and ceremony that Marcus had spent his life mastering. And yet, in that laughter, there is a truth that pierces the armor of the Stoic emperor. Freedom does not come from power or possessions, but from mastery over desire itself. Diogenes, with a single, piercing remark, challenges Marcus' understanding of life. Perhaps he says nothing at all, letting silence speak louder than words. Perhaps he hands the emperor a simple object, a staff, a piece of bread, a clay cup, and through it communicates an idea more potent than any lecture. The details are lost to history, yet the effect is undeniable. Marcus, the mighty ruler, feels a shiver of revelation. The lesson is not complex, it is brutally simple. To live freely, one must learn to want less, to be undaunted by opinion, and to seek virtue above applause. At that moment, the emperor glimpses a world beyond the gilded cages of Rome, beyond the endless pursuit of honor, beyond the invisible chains of pride and expectation. He sees a life stripped to its essentials, where the soul, not the throne, is sovereign. This is the lesson Marcus Aurelius would carry back to Rome, hiding it beneath the folds of his Stoic meditations, a seed planted by a man who lived centuries before, in a barrel, laughing at kings. But the story does not end here. That encounter, brief as it was, would ripple through Marcus' decisions, his writings, and even the legacy of the empire. The question lingers: How does a fleeting moment with a mad philosopher change the course of an emperor's life? And what secret did Marcus keep hidden from all of Rome? After that encounter with Diogenes, Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome carrying an invisible weight, an idea that refused to be ignored. The city welcomed him with its usual grandeur, senators in flowing togas, marble statues glinting in the sun, and the murmurs of citizens who hung on every decision of their emperor. Yet inside, Marcus' mind was far from the grandeur of the Senate or the noise of the Forum. He was wrestling with a truth that no lecture or tutor had ever impressed upon him: the emptiness of desire when it is pursued for its own sake. Rome in 167 CE was at the height of its power, but it was also a city teetering on tension. Wars raged along the Danube frontier, and the Marcomannic tribes threatened to spill into Roman lands. Marcus, though philosophical in nature, had to act decisively. Every choice could mean life or death for thousands of soldiers and citizens. And yet, amid the chaos of governance, he began to notice the whispers of Diogenes' philosophy creeping into his thoughts. Where others saw wealth, he saw indulgence. Where others saw honor, he began to see illusion. One evening, Marcus walked alone through the Palatine Gardens, the shadows of cypress trees stretching long under the moonlight. His mind replayed the image of the Cynic in his barrel, unshaken, unbowed, utterly free. How could one man, destitute by society's standards, wield a power that even the emperor could envy? Marcus realized that true authority was not in commanding armies or amassing gold, but in the ability to master one's own desires. He began experimenting with this idea in subtle ways. Advisors noticed changes in his demeanor, a new patience in decision-making, a quiet defiance toward flattery, an unusual humility in audience with senators who expected deference. He started questioning what really mattered, not for Rome, but for himself. Luxury palaces, expensive feasts, and ceremonial grandeur suddenly seemed trivial in comparison to the clarity he had glimpsed through Diogenes. But Rome is never forgiving of change. Rumors spread that the emperor had grown strange, that he was contemplating a philosophy too radical for a ruler. Some senators whispered that Marcus' Stoic ideals were veering dangerously close to folly. How could an emperor, entrusted with the empire's wealth and military might, adopt the mindset of a man who lived in a barrel and laughed at kings? Marcus, however, paid them little mind. The lesson he had absorbed was personal, a secret code of conduct that would guide his actions far beyond the reach of gossip. Yet the tension of the empire would test him. The Marcomannic wars intensified, and Marcus had to lead legions into harsh winters and treacherous forests. Soldiers admired his courage, but he carried a private struggle: how to reconcile his newfound detachment with the brutal realities of command. Every order he gave, every life lost or spared, became a meditation on the value of virtue over pride, of restraint over indulgence. He realized that the lesson of Diogenes was not passive, it demanded action, a disciplined life even amidst chaos. Meanwhile, in the quiet of his tent on the Danube frontier, Marcus began writing what would later become the Meditations, though they were never meant for public eyes. In these pages, he wrestled with the same paradox that Diogenes embodied: how to live freely while bound by duty, how to wield immense power without letting it consume the soul. He jotted phrases like, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts," and "wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." Behind these words was the invisible hand of the Cynic philosopher, guiding him toward a freedom that no emperor had ever achieved. But not everyone understood this transformation. Some generals saw hesitation in Marcus' orders as weakness. Some senators feared that his rejection of vanity would lead to instability. The more he embraced the Cynic lesson, the more he became an enigma, a ruler whose greatest victories were unseen, whose most profound power was internal. And yet, Marcus pressed on, driven by a vision he could not fully articulate, a vision of a ruler who was both emperor and philosopher, sovereign in body, mind, and spirit. Even so, the empire demanded spectacle. Public appearances, grand games, and ceremonial triumphs continued, but Marcus began to approach them differently. The applause no longer intoxicated him. He would sit silently, watching the crowd, pondering the emptiness of their desire for spectacle. In those moments, he could almost hear Diogenes' laughter, echoing across time, reminding him that the only true freedom is the mastery of self. And then came a moment that would test everything Marcus had learned, a confrontation not with enemies abroad, but with the very machinery of Rome itself. A senator, ambitious and cunning, accused one of Marcus' loyal generals of treachery. The court demanded blood, the populace demanded vengeance. Marcus felt the familiar pull of anger, pride, and fear, the emotions Diogenes had shown him to be the chains of the soul. In that instant, Marcus realized that the real battle was not against barbarians or rivals, but against the desires that threatened to enslave him. He paused, remembered the image of the old philosopher in his barrel, and made a choice that would forever define him as emperor and as a man. The decision was quiet, unseen, yet it carried more weight than any sword. And in that choice lay the first glimpse of a truth that would shape not only Marcus Aurelius' reign, but the legacy of Rome itself. The choice Marcus made that day shocked everyone, but no one outside his inner circle could see why. The senator, expecting fury, received only measured words. The general, awaiting punishment, received understanding and restraint. To outsiders, Marcus appeared cautious, even weak, but in truth, he was practicing the lesson of Diogenes. Freedom comes not from reacting to every insult or threat, but from mastering one's own impulses. The empire would see battles on the frontier, but the emperor's greatest victories were now internal, invisible, and profoundly transformative. This internal mastery began to reshape Marcus' relationships. Advisors who once flattered him found that empty praise no longer swayed his judgment. Friends who once courted his favor learned that the emperor could listen without envy or resentment. Even his own family felt a subtle shift. Commodus, his son, would later grow up witnessing a father whose authority was tempered by restraint, whose power was measured not by dominion, but by self-control. Marcus' embrace of Diogenes' lesson was quietly rewriting the dynamics of Rome's most influential households. But the emperor's transformation was not without struggle. Rome demanded spectacle, obedience, and the outward trappings of divinity. Marcus could not abandon these entirely. He had a duty to maintain the illusion that power alone commanded respect. And yet, every public appearance became a meditation, a balancing act between the expectations of men and the truths he had learned from the barrel-dwelling Cynic centuries before. The contrast was stark. Inside, Marcus practiced detachment. Outside, he maintained the appearance of the revered emperor. Few could glimpse the philosophy guiding his every step, but it was always there, shaping strategy, law, and even his private reflections. In the midst of wars and political intrigue, Marcus' writings flourished. He filled his notebooks with reflections on mortality, virtue, and the emptiness of desire. He wrote about the fleeting nature of fame and wealth, about the danger of attachment to reputation, and about the power of simplicity. In these meditations, Diogenes' influence is unmistakable. Consider the passage where Marcus advises himself to be like a rock amid the waves, to remain unmoved by applause or scorn. These were not just words. They were armor, a shield forged in the fires of philosophical confrontation with a man who lived in a barrel and mocked kings. Meanwhile, the empire's enemies continued to test Marcus' resolve. The Marcomanni and other tribes pressed harder against Rome's northern borders, exploiting winter's harshness and Rome's stretched legions. Soldiers admired their emperor's courage in battle, but Marcus' greatest struggle remained the control of his own mind. Could he face the chaos of war without letting anger, fear, or pride dictate his decisions? Could he maintain justice without succumbing to cruelty? It was a test that would have defeated many rulers. Yet Marcus approached it with the calm of a philosopher who had glimpsed the true nature of freedom. Yet the Cynic's lesson was not a shield against loneliness. Marcus often walked the camps at night, observing soldiers around their fires, contemplating the distance between desire and fulfillment. He knew that true mastery of the self was a solitary path. Even surrounded by advisors, generals, and soldiers, the emperor was alone in understanding the depth of Diogenes' wisdom. That solitude became both a burden and a source of clarity. The world could demand appearances, but the soul knew its own sovereignty. Then came the moment that would define Marcus' philosophical and imperial legacy, a personal crisis that no Senate vote, no military victory, could resolve. The plague swept through Rome and its provinces, claiming countless lives. The city reeled in fear and grief. The emperor, whose philosophical musings had already distanced him from vanity and attachment, now faced profound human suffering. How could one maintain inner freedom while witnessing such chaos? How could a ruler remain detached yet compassionate? Marcus found the answer in the simplicity of Diogenes' life. The Cynic had taught him that happiness is not found in controlling the world, but in mastering oneself. In the midst of disease, death, and despair, Marcus focused on what he could govern: his own reactions, his own virtues, and his own choices. He issued decrees to aid the sick, directed resources to care for the dying, and yet did not allow grief to cloud his judgment. It was a delicate balance, one that only a mind tempered by philosophy could achieve. Through it all, Marcus' respect for Diogenes' radical approach deepened. The emperor realized that the Cynic's strength lay not in rejection of life's responsibilities, but in clarity of purpose. Diogenes did not flee society. He transcended its distractions. Marcus began to understand that his power as emperor was not diminished by philosophy. Rather, philosophy gave him the clarity to wield it wisely. And in that realization, he discovered a hidden truth. The greatest lesson Diogenes ever taught him was not about poverty, mockery, or freedom alone. It was about aligning one's life with virtue, no matter the chaos around. But history rarely records these subtle victories. Marcus' personal transformation remained invisible to most, a secret embedded in the pages of his meditations and the quiet decisions he made as emperor. And yet, it was in these unseen choices that the true power of Diogenes' influence became apparent. The empire endured, wars were won, and Marcus Aurelius emerged not just as a ruler, but as a philosopher-king whose inner life was guided by lessons stolen from a man in a barrel centuries before. The question that lingers, however, is the one no historian can fully answer. If an emperor can learn such a profound truth from a forgotten Cynic, what other secrets of history remain hidden in fleeting encounters, unnoticed by the world, but shaping the course of empires? The years passed, and Marcus Aurelius' reign continued to be defined by trials, both external and internal. Wars along the Danube raged, political conspiracies festered in Rome, and plagues decimated populations. Yet amid all this chaos, the lesson of Diogenes remained his secret anchor. No one in the Senate could claim credit for his restraint. No general could take credit for his patience. This wisdom was private, cultivated in quiet reflection, in the secret dialogue between an emperor and a Cynic philosopher long dead. One particular incident tested Marcus' mastery like never before. A faction of senators, ambitious and cunning, plotted to undermine his authority. They presented falsified reports of rebellion in the provinces, hoping to provoke a brutal response and tarnish the emperor's reputation. Most emperors, driven by pride and the desire to display power, would have reacted with immediate force. Marcus, however, paused. He remembered the barrel in Athens, the figure who had laughed at kings and armies alike. He remembered the lesson: anger and desire are chains. Rather than yielding to wrath, Marcus conducted a quiet investigation, uncovering the truth without public spectacle. The conspirators were punished, not with vengeance, but with justice measured in proportion to their crime. In doing so, Marcus demonstrated the ultimate power of restraint, to act decisively, yet without being enslaved by emotion. Rome's citizens and soldiers would later marvel at the fairness of his reign, unaware that the guiding principle behind it was borrowed from a philosopher who scorned authority itself. Meanwhile, the emperor's personal writings grew more introspective. In the Meditations, Marcus reflects on the fleeting nature of fame, the inevitability of death, and the importance of living according to virtue. Phrases like, receive without pride, let go without attachment, echo the Cynic worldview. The emperor had internalized the idea that the trappings of power, titles, gold, armies, were secondary to the state of the soul. This was revolutionary, not in the eyes of Rome, but in the intimate realm of his own conscience. Yet Marcus' embrace of simplicity did not make him distant from the human world. He remained a ruler who carried the burdens of an empire, yet he could walk among the poor, the soldiers, and the grieving without judgment or envy. There is a famous account of him visiting the camps along the Danube, where he observed the suffering of soldiers firsthand, eating their meager meals and sleeping in their tents. The act was not political theater, it was philosophy in action, a living tribute to the lesson he had learned from Diogenes centuries before. The emperor's health, however, began to decline. Years of war, travel, and plague took their toll. Marcus, ever reflective, pondered mortality more intensely than ever. He confronted the same question Diogenes had faced in his life: how to meet death with dignity, free from fear, desire, or attachment. Unlike other rulers who amassed wealth or secured legacies through grandiose monuments, Marcus focused on cultivating the virtues that would outlive him: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. In these quiet reflections, the emperor reached a state of clarity few would ever achieve. But the most profound moment came when he considered his son, Commodus. Marcus had hoped to pass on not just the throne, but the principles he had learned, the discipline of the mind, the independence of the soul. Yet he saw in his son a different spirit, one captivated by spectacle, indulgence, and ego. Marcus understood that true freedom, the kind Diogenes had shown him, could not be handed down as an inheritance. It had to be earned. And in that painful realization, the emperor grasped the full weight of the Cynic's lesson. Wisdom cannot be forced, only discovered through experience and choice. In these final reflections, Marcus Aurelius distilled a lifetime of power, responsibility, and philosophical inquiry into a single, enduring truth: that freedom lies not in dominance, riches, or accolades, but in the mastery of the self. The lesson stolen from Diogenes had become his compass, guiding every action, every decision, every thought. He ruled with patience, he loved with restraint, and he faced death without fear. And yet, the question that haunts history remains: how many rulers, kings, and leaders throughout time have glimpsed such a truth, only to let pride, desire, or circumstance erase it? Marcus Aurelius, for a fleeting moment, understood it fully, and in doing so, left behind a legacy far greater than any empire could measure. As the years waned, Marcus Aurelius grew increasingly contemplative. The empire still demanded his attention, the Marcomannic Wars dragged on, and Rome faced economic strain, political unrest, and the ever-present threat of disease. Yet, Marcus carried himself differently now. Where others sought glory in triumphs or monuments, he sought mastery over his own desires. The lesson of Diogenes, learned centuries before in a fleeting encounter, had matured within him like a seed grown into a towering tree. In his private quarters, Marcus often revisited the image of the Cynic philosopher sunbathing in the marketplace, the old man's audacity and simplicity etched into memory. How strange it seemed, he thought, that a man living in a barrel, spurning wealth and power, could wield a freedom that emperors with legions and gold could never achieve. Yet that freedom was not about defiance. It was about clarity, about discerning what truly matters, and letting the rest fall away. Marcus realized that the empire itself was less significant than the ruler's inner life. His reflections deepened as he faced mortality. Marcus had always been aware that life was fleeting, but now, guided by Diogenes' austere wisdom, he embraced the reality of death without fear or regret. In the Meditations, he wrote of the transient nature of existence, urging himself to live in accordance with reason and virtue. Each day, each decision, became a testament to the philosophy he had internalized, a life shaped not by ambition, but by discipline and self-mastery. The paradox of his rule became evident. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the most powerful empire in the world, had discovered a freedom that no conquest, gold, or title could provide. Publicly, he remained the Stoic leader, commanding armies, adjudicating justice, and maintaining Rome's grandeur. Privately, he walked a path of simplicity and virtue, guided by a Cynic who had lived centuries before, in a barrel, mocking the trappings of society. The emperor's greatest victories were invisible, yet their influence resonated throughout his reign. Even as the shadow of death loomed, Marcus sought to impart what he could to the world around him. He tried to guide Commodus, hoping his son might understand that true greatness lay in self-control, humility, and reason. He encouraged advisors and soldiers to act with justice rather than impulse. And through his writings, he left a blueprint for wisdom, one that would inspire generations long after marble crumbled and Rome itself faded into history. Yet he knew, as all wise men must, that the greatest truths are often hidden, understood only by those willing to see beyond appearances. As his final days approached, Marcus reflected on the fleeting nature of life, the vanity of power, and the enduring value of virtue. The emperor who had once been consumed by duty and expectation now found serenity in simplicity. He realized that Diogenes' lesson had not merely influenced him, it had transformed him. To live freely, to face mortality without fear, to act with justice amidst chaos. These were the gifts stolen from a man in a barrel, gifts that even the throne could not provide. And so, the story ends not with conquest or ceremony, but with a quiet truth. The greatest power an emperor can wield is the mastery of his own mind, the ability to live without enslavement to desire, and the courage to embrace simplicity in a world obsessed with grandeur. Marcus Aurelius, guided by the ghostly wisdom of a Cynic philosopher, had achieved a freedom far beyond the reach of kings, armies, or empires. History remembers the emperor, the philosopher, the Stoic. But hidden in the pages of his meditations is the shadow of a man who laughed at kings, who lived in a barrel, and who taught one of the greatest rulers of Rome the secret that power alone could never reveal.